Okay. Have you ever found yourself in a bad situation where you knew for certain it was entirely your own fault? Felt that 1-2 punch of, I'm really suffering and I know that it was my bad decision that put me here. I've found myself in that place a few times in my life. And today I'd like to continue what seems to be becoming a tradition of opening sermons with embarrassing personal stories by telling you about the time I broke my collarbone the night before beginning my freshman year of college. I went to college on a cross-country and track scholarship. And without that scholarship, there's no way I could have afforded the school that I went to. So my ability to go to college was almost entirely dependent on my ability to run. Now, on the final night of our cross-country training camp, which was also the night before classes started for my freshman year, I was out with some guys I had just met, and we were riding longboards, which are like just long skateboards. And I had a lot of longboarding experience in Pancake Flat, Nebraska, but the modest hills of Chicagoland were proving to be a bit of a challenge. And you might be able to guess where this is going. Hoping to look cool in front of my new friends, I tried going down a moderately large hill. I immediately started going too fast. I fell off onto the concrete, hit the ground, and my collarbone snapped like a twig. And that hurt. But what I remember more than that is the fear that set in when I realized what had happened and when a doctor told me that I wasn't going to be able to run for 2 months. I felt ashamed for doing something so risky at this very critical, important point in my life. I was afraid of what my new teammates were going to think of me. I was terrified of what my coach was going to say. Ultimately, I was afraid of losing my scholarship. So it was this moment where like pain and fear and embarrassment all kind of mixed together. You know what I mean? Now this morning we are going to read Psalm 130, which is a lament psalm in which the author begins by expressing some very similar emotions. So let's read Psalm 130 here, a song of ascents. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can with reverence serve you. I wait for the Lord, my whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning, more than watchmen wait for the morning. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. May God bless the reading and hearing of our Holy Scriptures. So, this psalm is part of a collection of psalms titled the Songs of Ascents. You may have noticed that title right at the top of the scripture. This collection is Psalms 120 to 134. And the most common theory is that these were songs that were sung by groups of Jewish pilgrims who were traveling to Jerusalem for festivals and things like that. The city of Jerusalem is set on this high hill, so when you travel to it from any direction around, you're always walking uphill. So you actually do ascend into the city, hence songs of ascents. So this is a walking song. It's one for the road. It's a song for people in the middle of a journey, people who have left home but have not yet reached their destination. And when we read and speak the words of this song, we are taken on a journey as well. Remember that this poem isn't just words that are meant to be read on a page. It is a worship song that's meant to be performed by a worshiping community. And in that act of performance, the words are meant to work on our hearts. So these words aren't just a reflection of one author's experience. They're meant to help us give language to and find a path through our own experiences. So the experience that this song puts us in is one of being in the depths, a place of sitting in a deep hole, being unsure of how we're going to get out. And it seems from the rest of the poem that this is meant to be a hole, a depth that we have dug ourselves into. And like I said before, many of us know about those kinds of depths, right? Ruining your cross-country season by breaking your collarbone in a skateboarding accident is one example, but it's far from the deepest depth. I can think of deeper depths in my own life, although those aren't as fun of stories to tell in a sermon. Depths of finances and relationships, careers and health. I think all of us can think of times like that in our own lives. And sitting in those depths, we call out to help from God. Of course, there are lots of different places we could turn for help when we're in the depths. But in this song, we acknowledge that God is the one who can truly help us when we're in this kind of trouble. And God's help in times of trouble is certainly multifaceted. But the aspect of God's help that we're focusing on in this psalm is forgiveness. When we mess up our lives, when we hurt ourselves and other people, when we sin, God doesn't hold our actions against us. God doesn't keep score of the bad things that we've done. You know, I'm sure most of us can think of a time when we've messed up and we told someone or they found out about it and they came at us and wagged their finger and said, you know, that was really stupid. And you're always doing things like this. This is just like the time before and the time before that and the time before that. And whatever they say in that moment might be objectively true, but it doesn't really help in the moment. Because like the psalm says, if anybody chooses to play that game of keeping records of our wrongdoings, that is something that nobody can ultimately stand up to. And that is especially true if God, who knows us more intimately than anybody else, would do that. When we play that game of keeping the record of wrongs, we ultimately just end up being pushed deeper into the hole that we've dug for ourselves. So when we're in the depths, what we need first is a forgiving presence. We need to be given hope that somehow things can be okay, to establish some kind of relational safety and to know that we're not alone in our trouble. And when we have that kind of presence with us, then we can get in the position to actually climb out of the hole we've dug. So in this psalm, we confess that our God is that kind of forgiving presence. And because of that, we can find help, we're able to serve and worship God, and we have hope. Now, something really interesting happens in the second half of this psalm. So notice in the first half, we are speaking directly to God. But then stanza 3 hits, and it says, I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. Suddenly, we're not speaking to God, we're speaking about God to somebody else. And then stanza 4 begins, and it becomes clear who we are talking to. It says, Israel, put your hope in the Lord. For with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. So the author of this psalm switches from talking directly to God to talking to his people, the people of Israel, calling them to put their hope in God. And of course, we're not ancient Israelites, so we can broaden this out a bit and say that with the final section of this psalm, we turn to our own faith community and call each other to put our hope in the God of forgiveness. It's like once we've experienced God's forgiveness in our own life and put our individual hope in that, then we can realize that God's forgiveness is the only hope we have as a community as well. And hope is a really powerful thing. Hope is trust extended into the future. And what we put our hope in guides how we act in the world. And in this psalm, I see 2 options for where we can put our hope as a community. The first option, in the words of the psalm, is keeping a record of sins. The hope here would be that if we can find the bad people among us, if we can call them out and punish them and purge them from the community, then those of us who are left, the good people, can be happy and safe together. And when we look out at our world, I think we see lots of communities and lots of people who are being guided by that kind of hope. We see it in political parties and in Facebook groups, in club sports, and yes, even in churches. Lots of people devoting lots of energy to sniffing out who in their community isn't progressive or conservative enough, whose parenting isn't gentle enough, who made a problematic joke, who isn't patriotic enough. Lots of effort put into sniffing these people out. And when those people are found, one way or another, they are ultimately purged from the community. And that's how a community turns into a purity movement. And the problem with purity movements, it turns out, is that none of us are actually pure. None of us are blameless or perfect. If we go looking for each other's sins, if we really devote our energies to that, there's always going to be more to find. There is no end to that game. So if that's where we really put our hope, in separating ourselves from the sinners among us, what we end up doing is entering into this never-ending cycle of division. And I really believe that that faulty kind of hope explains a huge amount of the fragmentation and division that we see in our world today all over the place. Now, as the church, we're called to a different kind of hope. The church is not called to be a purity movement. We are not a community of the good people in here who have hope and happiness because we've separated ourselves from the bad sinners out there. Instead, we recognize that we are a community made up of forgiven sinners. Each of us are imperfect. Each of us are consistently messing our lives up in one way or another. You know what I mean? And each of us are consistently loved and forgiven by God. The goodness that brings us together as a community isn't ours, it's God's. And of course, we are called to grow, to reflect God's goodness more and more in our lives. But our inclusion in God's community is not based on how well we live up to that. As a church, we are primarily a forgiven community. That's where we put our hope. And that hope and that identity should guide us to also being a forgiving community. That is a community with the goal of bringing people together who might otherwise be separated by some individual or corporate sin. You know, back in college with my broken collarbone, I experienced my cross-country team as a forgiving community. You know, I remember after I fell, a few of my new teammates who were around dragged me up to my room, and not knowing what else to do, they called our coach, and he came into my dorm room. And that would have been a perfect opportunity for him to wag his finger in my face and say, you know, this was really stupid. How could you do this? But thankfully, that's not what he did. He looked at my shoulder and he said, I'm so sorry. And then he looked at my teammates around me and he said, you need to get this kid to a hospital. Which they did. These people that I had just met drove me to the hospital, and they sat with me in the ER waiting room and through the visit with the doctors, and then drove me back. And I stayed on the team. I wasn't expelled. I still went to practice every day. I still went to meets, even though I couldn't run. And some huge things happened in my life as a result of that. I made many of the most important relationships in my life, including meeting my wife, Hannah. I kept my scholarship, which allowed me to stay in school and get the degree that allowed me to be hired at St. Andrews 4 years later. All of that only possible because I was forgiven and held in community after doing something pretty stupid. You know, the history of the United Methodist Church provides another really cool example of what I'm talking about here. You might remember last week, Pastor John talked about how in 1845, the two largest Christian denominations in the United States split over the issue of slavery, which was a big deal. And one of those denominations was called the Methodist Episcopal Church, which had a large group of churches break off to form the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And you can imagine how strong and nasty that fight must have been. But then 94 years later, in 1939, something interesting happened. Those two denominations, along with another denomination called the Methodist Protestant Church, merged together to form a new denomination called the Methodist Church. And then a few years later, in 1968, the Methodist Church merged again with another denomination called the Evangelical United Brethren Church to form the United Methodist Church. And this is actually one of the things that makes me most proud to be a United Methodist, is that we are formed from a history of groups that had previously been separated over big, important things coming back together. In a very real way, we are a denomination that is founded on forgiveness. And I'll tell you, I see that history reflected in the makeup of our community here at St. Andrews too. In a world that is so divided by beliefs about various political issues that are important and worth talking about, it is so common in our world to say that the people who oppose us on these things are evil and shouldn't be associated with. And in the midst of that kind of political climate, we are a community made up of people from all over the political spectrum. And we're not held together because we keep quiet about anything that might be controversial to keep the peace. We actually dig in and have difficult conversations and find incredible ways to pursue justice in our world together. By most worldly standards in 2024, we're a community that should not be able to hold together. And yet here we are. We stand together as a community as a testament to God's goodness and forgiveness, not our own goodness. God has brought us together, and God holds us together as a church community. Pastor John also preached last week from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and I'd like to read another short passage from this letter today, from chapter 2. Paul says, "Christ is our peace. He made both Jews and Gentiles into one group. With his body, he broke down the barrier of hatred that divided us. He canceled the detailed rules of the law so that he could create one new humanity out of the two groups, making peace. He reconciled them both as one body to God by the cross, which ended the hostility to God. So now you are no longer strangers and aliens. Rather, you are fellow citizens with God's people, and you belong to God's household." That's the good news that holds us together. Because we are all so prone to messing our lives up, Jesus has come to pull us out of the depths, to offer us God's forgiveness, and to join us to the new humanity that Jesus has created. And it's a new humanity founded on forgiveness. A community of forgiven sinners who in turn extend that forgiveness to others. That's the hope for our world.